All right. Good evening, everyone. It's fantastic to see such a huge crowd here tonight. Really doing the auditorium justice. My name is Steve Tinney, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Penn Museum. One of the nice things about having so many people is that there must be about 5 people in here who haven't heard this introduction before. Many thanks to all of you for coming to our beautifully restored Harrison Auditorium for tonight's installment of our annual Greats Lectures. This year, of course, our theme is Great Catastrophes. And little did we know, although, I've said that for the last 5 or 6 lectures, and this afternoon as I was reviewing it, I thought, you know what, we should have known. Catastrophes happen all the time. It was obvious, right? They're just getting more and more appropriate, yeah? The next lecture in our series will hopefully not be too appropriate. Will be on April 1st, no fooling. And will feature Dr. Simon Martin, Associate Curator in the American section here at the Penn Museum, and an annual favorite at the Greats Lectures. Simon's topic will be the classic Maya collapse, new evidence on a great mystery. In March, we celebrate Member Month. So I'd like to take this moment to give a special thanks to all of our members in the audience. Your support, Your support of the museum makes our exhibitions, community programs, and annual mission fulfillment possible. On behalf of all of us at the museum, thank you. We hope you enjoy some of the extra special events and perks we've created for you this month, including discounted admission to the Mütter Museum's Spit Spreads Death exhibition. So, see the lecture, see the show, the movie's coming soon. You can read more in our calendar of events. As usual, after the lecture, there will be time for questions, which will be moderated by our speaker. If you'd like to ask a question, we would very much appreciate it if you would come to one of the microphones that are standing in the aisles, one over there and one over there, so that everyone can hear the question clearly. And we've asked our presenter to encourage that behavior as well. And so, to our presenter, and I must say it's really a great pleasure to be able to welcome such a distinguished speaker from a museum which has long been a great friend of our Penn Museum, the Mütter Museum's Dr. Robert D. Hicks. Dr. Hicks is Senior Consulting Scholar and William Paul Measey Chair for the History of Medicine at the College of Physicians of Philadelphia. For over a decade, he served as Director of the Mütter Museum and a Historical Medical Library at the college. He has worked with museum-based education for over 3 decades, primarily as a consultant to historic sites and museums. Robert has a doctorate in maritime history from the University of Exeter, United Kingdom, quite close to where I grew up, and degrees in archaeology and anthropology from the University of Arizona. He also served as a naval officer with the U.S. Naval Security Group and found time to have a career in law enforcement. His most recent book, Civil War Medicine, A Surgeon's Experience, appeared in 2019 by Indiana University Press. So as it happens, and I'm sure a lot of you have been discussing this before the event, we did not plan this, at least not quite in this way, but Robert is going to talk to us tonight about a catastrophe which has eerily contemporary resonances. So please join me now in welcoming him to share with us Spit Spreads Death, the Influenza Pandemic of 1918-19 in Philadelphia. Robert.
Sound check first of all. Am I audible? No. Is this working? All right, stick with us then. Thank you all for attending. I thank the museum for inviting me to be here. It's wonderful to be in this beautiful auditorium. And I appreciate Steve mentioning all my bona fides, but the most important one he did not mention. I am a friend of the museum. It is no accident that I have put patriotic imagery up alongside a picture of a health worker. The diseases in human history contour populations, but also human culture contours disease. And the marriage of disease and patriotism is a big part of my story. And I would like to call your attention. My red dot is on the gauze mask over here. There's a little color button here, and I simply want you to take note of its existence. It will come back to haunt you later. And a word from my sponsor. Mütter Museum has been mentioned. We are very humble bearers of this National Historic Landmark as birthplace of American medicine. Philadelphia is a city of medical firsts. First hospital here in Pennsylvania Hospital, first medical school right here on campus, and there's a long list of firsts. And the physicians who pioneered these institutions in the 18th and early 19th century formed a College of Physicians of Philadelphia to upgrade the standards of medical work and to relieve human suffering. I begin with a local scene. But before I begin, it's important to mention that I would like you to think of this next hour as 1918. And we will have to work a little bit to get into that mindset. But remember patriotism. But we're going to start here at St. Joe's College. In October of 1918, classes were suspended for the seminarians. And the reason was that Philadelphia was beset by the flu. And by mid-October, it had disabled the city's infrastructure. The seminary students were gathered together and told, classes are canceled, and here's what we're going to do. We're going to put you in pairs. And we're going to equip each pair of students with a cart and a horse. And your job is to walk up and down the residential streets and call out for the dead. This is a scene from medieval Europe, and it's also a scene from 20th century Philadelphia. We have airplanes, we have radio, we have cars, and this is what has happened. Why? How did we get there? Frank Bieberstein was one of those seminarians, and he recollected this years later, and it turns out the Catholic Diocese, Archdiocese of Philadelphia, has a treasure trove of photographs and documentation about the flu. And who knew? You had to go look for it, but there it is, including pictures such as this of seminarians digging mass graves. And it's Frank Bieberstein who had that recollection of being told, here's what you're going to do, here's your cart and horse. And he and his partner took turns going in and out of houses when they were called to retrieve a body. And that's what they did, day in, day out for several weeks until the pandemic abated. But 1918, a lot's going on this year. World War I is in progress. The end is not yet in sight, but I'm going to focus on the fall and late summer of 1918, the activities leading up to and including what happened with the flu. Now, World War I is going on. The United States has entered the war the year before, but European countries have been at war since 1914. But at this point, we have 1.5 million soldiers in France. So medical personnel in the area hospitals have gone over to France to attend to the military hospitals. So we do not have Philadelphia's hospitals at full medical personnel strength. Politics go on as usual. The Senate is about to consider a bill to enfranchise women. But if you were listening to me in 1918, before I could begin, before the concert you're attending could take place, before the theatrical performance could take place in 1918, you first had to hear from a 4-minute man. The 4-minute men, they were government-paid men to step forth and give a short talk up to 4 minutes to encourage you to buy war bonds to support the war effort. I'm going to read you a portion of an actual 4-minute speech. Ladies and gentlemen, I have just received the information that there is a German spy among us, a German spy watching us. He's around here somewhere, reporting upon you and me and sending reports about us to Berlin and telling the Germans just what we are doing with the Liberty Loan fundraising drive. From every section of the country, these spies have been getting reports over to Berlin, and not just the general reports, but the details, where the loan is going well, where its success seems weak, and what people are saying. For the German government is worried about our great loan. They fear its effect upon the German morale, and they are raising a loan this month too. If the American people lend their billions now, one and all, with a hip hip hurrah, it means that America is united and strong. But if we lend our money half-heartedly, America seems weak and autocracy remains strong. Money means everything now. Americans can have but one opinion and only one wish in the Liberty Loan. Well, I hope those spies are getting their messages straight and letting Berlin know that America is hurling back these answers. For treachery everywhere, $1 billion. For murder of American women and children, $1 billion more. In the world fight for liberty, our share, billions and billions and endless billions. Do not let the German spy hear and report that you are a slacker. The two terms that you did not want to hear in public would be to call someone a hoarder for hoarding supplies and food, and a slacker for just not pulling up your socks and doing your best in this war effort. And that means contributing money. So let's take a look at Philadelphia at this time. You see the population figure. Population has swelled 300,000 people due to mostly immigrants coming here for war work. This is one of the largest industrial cities of the North. At this time, Philadelphia has the largest African-American population, and we are doing everything to push war work, war industry, war speak, war patriotism, as every other city in the country is doing. But I mentioned hospital staff is depleted. Pennsylvania Hospital was down 75% in their doctors and nursing staff. On average, all hospitals in the city were down about 25 to 35% in their professional staff at this time. Everybody is in France supporting the troops. But by late summer, the word is out. The flu is happening. Spanish flu is what people talk about, and there's nothing Spanish about it other than in Spain, as the flu cases erupted, no press censorship was being exercised, which was true everywhere else. United States, everywhere else, we had censorship of these reports. So at first, the flu became known as the Spanish flu. It was hitting multiple cities, sometimes days within each other, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes months apart. It's very difficult to make a valid claim that it started in one particular place first, and it's appearing around the world. The city of Exeter is a British merchant ship that came up the river with flu cases. Someone decided this is not good, let's quarantine these people. They took them to a hospital in town. They kept the ward quarantined. Some of these people, some of these sailors died of the flu, but the city was on notice that the flu had come to town. And those people who had public health duties were definitely taking notice. Quarantine was discussed, but it's amazing how quickly these things began to permeate popular culture. A children's rhyme that had been coined in a previous flu outbreak makes a comeback. So you can imagine girls skipping rope to, I had a little bird and its name was Enza. I opened up the window and in flew Enza. The word influenza has been in our vocabulary for 5 centuries. It shows up first in Italy, not specific to the flu as we recognize it, but to other disease disasters that seem to come from nowhere and then disappear to nowhere, and its literal meaning is astrological, from the heavens. But by the time the flu hits in 1918, everybody knows what this means. It means a distinct virus with distinct symptoms. Now, the guy in charge of looking out for Philadelphians' health is this man, Dr. Wilmer Cruzen. He's a gynecologist. He's apparently good at what he does. He's a political appointee in a city that is very much driven by machine hall politics, like Tammany Hall, New York. It's a big city, and there's political patronage to the extent that South Philadelphia at this time does not even have a high school. For people in impoverished neighborhoods, South Philadelphia being one of them, being close to the shipyards where the war work is taking place, There are no services to speak of. Public health services are virtually absent, and there are no hospitals in those areas. There are few. There's one, no longer exists, that served the immigrant population. But you did not have easy access to health care or even some basic necessities of life if you lived in some of these neighborhoods. Now, Cruzen knew that there are flu cases. He is minimizing these. In mid-September, he puts out some advisories to suggest the flu's out there, folks, you're going to hear about it, and here are some health measures you should take. Avoid crowds, don't spend a lot of time in public places, which is why I'm particularly glad to see all of us sharing this airspace tonight. But he was reluctant to admit that Philadelphia could have a problem, mindful that there had been some cases. He is not taking any steps to plan for a problem. No resources are being allocated. No supplies are being marshaled and secured just in case. So the city is not ready for what is about to happen. Now, newspapers are not reporting on flu cases locally. They may be reporting on some of them from afar because they don't want to run the risk of being unpatriotic. There has not been a time in U.S. history before or since World War I where the restrictions on public expression, free speech, was as restricted as it was during World War I. Congress passed two acts, Sedition Act and an Espionage Act, which forbade virtually any public criticism of the government. Somebody was actually criminally charged, not in Philadelphia but elsewhere, for making a public criticism about the federal budget. The American Red Cross did something that annoyed somebody who complained about it publicly and was summarily arrested. So that's the level of restriction. That's the atmosphere. Patriotism is all important. Everything subordinate to the war effort. A few doctors have approached Dr. Cruzen and say, you know, there's a parade coming up to accelerate this fund drive. Maybe not a good idea to bring people out. Well, Cruzen is not about to cancel that, and nobody would have been able to do that. Had he protested other authorities and said, we're not going to do this parade, he would have been summarily replaced and somebody would have made it possible. He has no background in public health, but he's trying to do the best he can. Now, this is the Liberty Loan Parade that takes place at the end of September 1918. The day before this parade, Chicago had its fundraising parade for the 4th Liberty Loan Fund Drive. These two newspapers, the Philadelphia Inquirer, in the lower one, you see a man in a dark suit with a top hat. That's President Wilson. He marched in that parade. Now, in Chicago, doctors grumbled about we could have consequences to this parade, but higher authorities decided to go ahead with the parade anyway. But they issued advice. They said, we are mindful that the flu could circulate here, so if you're in this parade here in Chicago today, when you're done, you go home. You take off your clothes. If you've been perspiring, you got a towel off your body, get clean, take a laxative, and go to bed. That was the prophylactic advice. Philadelphia did not have that. Now that button you see up in the upper right is known as an honor button. And if you gave money to the war effort, you would wear that button. And if you did not have that button, people would accost you on the street and accuse you of being a slacker. Now, I'm wearing my 1918 4th Liberty Loan button, and I don't see many in the audience today. So you'll have to draw your own conclusions. Now, this parade was the largest parade in Philadelphia history, about 200,000 people. The parade route itself ran about 6 miles. As you can see from the photograph, the parade consisted of a lot of military hardware, a lot of military rah-rah patriotism. On street corners, widows of American soldiers were asked to stand and conduct impromptu sidewalk seminars on the sacrifices of their husbands or their fathers or their sons, as the case may be. Cruzen has been downplaying the flu up until the parade. By the time the parade happens, it's starting to percolate. 2 days after the parade, he declares that we have an epidemic. And 72 hours after that parade, taking us into the first day or two of October, every hospital bed in the city is now filled. and you see the mortality statistics begins to spike very, very quickly. This disables the city within days. The police really do have a blue flu. Many of them can't come to work because they're getting sick. Taxi services are not running because there are too many drivers sick. You already know the situation with the hospital staffing, and now people are starting to show up in droves, if they can, for medical treatment. Medical schools are not operating. They're telling the medical students or the nursing students, just go out there and find a way to do good. And you see the patriotic posters. Very characteristically, the German soldier is always shown as having huge feet in boots, small heads, bent posture, and somewhere they're holding a bloody implement, either a bayonet, knife, whatever. And they're always dragging a girl away, or they're in some cases coming into your window, which I showed you a moment ago. So the patriotism is running at full tilt. People are still expected to turn out and do fund drive things, even while this pandemic is starting to unfold. No one's using that word yet. Epidemic is the word you're using. Now, this photograph on the right is rather interesting because you see a lamppost with a spit spreads death sign. This sign was quickly printed up and distributed and posted to get people not to spit. You've already seen some pictures, I think, of people wearing gauze masks. And the spit spreads death sign is superimposed over another sign. The state of siege of this disease happened so rapidly that the patriotic banners had not been removed from the lamppost from the parade. So the spit spreads death sign has been superimposed over one of those signs. Things start to close. Schools close. Concerts are canceled. School classes are canceled. And hospitals are set up everywhere where there's a big space and there's a supply of cots and somebody to attend to people. We start to see newspaper coverage locally when the dead starts to increase in number. Over the course of 6 weeks, one Philadelphian dies every 5 minutes of the flu, or consequences connected with the flu. Frequently pneumonia is a cause of death, with the contributing cause being influenza. And the casualty reports start to show up, particularly when prominent citizens are felled by the flu. They are, of course, written up. The society pages become, in a way, a flu roster of the who's who. Here you see another grave. I think this one originally came from the Catholic Archdiocese, was printed in the Enquirer. Mass graves being dug. The city morgue had space for about 36 bodies. Within days, people are piling bodies outside, stacking them up. Coffins are in very short supply. There are really no funeral services operating anymore because they have to essentially declare martial law on their own activities. They simply can't attend. Funerals, if they happen, are conducted out of doors, not inside churches. But people are now resorting to taking the dead themselves out of their own homes and burying them in many cases, or taking them to cemeteries and simply leaving their dead there. So the infrastructure is coming apart. It's coming to a halt. And you see these words highlighted in yellow here. Any person with 2 hands and willingness to work. This was put in the newspaper. The mayor put this out, soliciting any able-bodied non-sick person to show up and help run the city. Now, in Steve's introduction, he mentioned we certainly didn't plan on the larger world picture here before this talk was scheduled tonight, coronavirus. But in 1918, to those who are historically minded, this is running very close parallel to 1793 Philadelphia, when Philadelphia was the capital city of the young United States, and yellow fever hit. And yellow fever killed off about 10% of the Philadelphia population. And at that time, the mayor put a message in the newspaper: anyone able with 2 hands and a willingness to work, show up and we'll assign you a job for the day. And that's how the city ran in 1918, and that's how it ran in 1793. Now let's look at the symptoms and how people responded to this. Well, flu symptoms are not exactly cold symptoms. They are an overlap, but there is a distinct difference. A lot of people at that parade apparently had the flu and didn't know it yet. They were enjoying, if that's the right word, an incubation period before the symptoms really manifested themselves. But the aches and pains, the coughs, these are familiar for people who have light cases of the flu. But 1918 was different. Now, we're always getting the advice that we've got to protect the very young and the very old. Those are two populations most susceptible to flu season or to other diseases. Now, this also applied to 1918, but with a very distinctive difference. There was a huge spike for active, healthy young adults. To this day, no one knows precisely why that was. You could be healthy, get up, have breakfast, go to work, feel a little odd by lunchtime, get sick in the afternoon, and be dead by evening. The symptoms could advance that quickly. And in those cases, at one stage, you look like this man with a cyanotic face, because in the extreme cases, you begin to get disoriented. Your senses are affected, as it says here. Your sight, your color vision can be affected because pressure builds up on the optic nerve, so your environment simply doesn't look like it should. People are not sounding like they should. And people in these extreme cases may start to bleed out of orifices they're not supposed to, eyes, ears, nose. And they can experience even loss of hair and teeth. Now, with people being advised to avoid a lot of interpersonal contact, particularly avoid crowds, people did begin to notice that those people with the flu have a distinct odor about them, and it's like the odor of musty straw. And in those extreme cases where the cyanosis appears, those cases are judged to be fatal. What's happening there is the flu is going to take your lungs apart. It is stripping those cells that convey the oxygen into your bloodstream and dissolving your lungs into a bloody, frothy mix. I could be more colorful if you like, but that is the reality. And people approaching that stage were also described as exhibiting a particular sound, a crackling sound, as if you took bubble wrap and crunched it in your hands. And that is lungs coming apart. Now, in the absence of authority, people will resort to word-of-mouth solutions or remedies. I've already heard it circulating with coronavirus and the use of garlic. Who knows? But among my favorites from the 1918 are the red pepper sandwiches, even prophylactic removal of tonsils, use of chloroform if you can get it. And I should say that our exhibit at the Mütter Museum, Spitz Red's Death, opened in October. And at the opening event, we served red pepper sandwiches. And to my knowledge, not a single person at that event has come down with the flu. Nurses with gauze masks. Some cities mandated as a criminal offense the wearing of masks. And if you didn't, you were escorted out of public view and you were brought before a judge, you were fined. Philadelphia did not do that, but the wearing of gauze masks was encouraged. Now, you have to remember, in 1918, we are calling influenza a virus, but it has not been identified in a laboratory. So it is still an unknown tiny element somewhere. And as a result, there's no remedy, there's no vaccine, although the occasion of the pandemic caused intensive research to begin, and it continued for years to find that vaccine and identify the virus. It didn't happen in 1918, though. Now, these nurses are sitting in front of a poster I want to call your attention to. It reminds you about the patriotic imagery and the challenge of that imagery that's ever present in your working lives. Because this says in the back, showing a couple of nurses with a sick soldier, "If I fail, he dies." This is the kind of stark message that is imprinted on the available health professionals. Now, the fund drive ends while all this is going on, and you may not be surprised to know that Philadelphia not only met but exceeded its fundraising goal for the Fourth Liberty Loan. So the patriotism narrative is preeminent. Yes, we're suffering and dying, but by God, we're going to support the troops. Now, an interesting thing begins to happen. after Philadelphia has been slammed with this event. Before the United States entered the war, and during the war, a Citizens Council was created. And it's on the bottom here, the Philadelphia Council of National Defense. These were well-connected people who were volunteering their time to sit on a board to do one thing, to regulate the war work going on in Philadelphia. For example, you might have some company over here that makes mattresses that's now making something else for the war effort, and there's somebody over on the other end of town making the same thing. You want to make sure that the employees are getting the same wages, for example. So this board would exercise oversight to make sure equitable working conditions, pay, and so on. The members of this board thought, wait a minute, we have convened to do this war work. Why don't we convene to do what the city is not doing and do something about the flu? So they put out this ad. It advertises a phone number, and remember, phones operate through switchboards, and switchboard operators are getting sick. So people are being told, do not make phone calls unless they're emergency calls. And it was also very difficult for the available doctors and nurses because people would call, doctors and nurses would go out, may get to wherever they have to go and find that the problem is far worse than they anticipated, or maybe the problem had solved itself or gone away and they weren't needed, but it's a waste of time. So these people created a headquarters in Strawbridge's department store, set up this phone number, and they divided the city into districts. And they organized all available medical personnel by district. And when a call came in, they would send out not a doctor, not a nurse, but somebody else to reconnoiter and determine what was really needed at the scene, come back, assign the resources from that district, and send them out. Ambulances, pretty much non-existent, but the American Red Cross had a disaster committee, and they started running an ambulance service, but private citizens would report in who were able-bodied, with two hands willingness to drive, and say, I'll volunteer my car, and if you volunteered your car to be an ambulance, you were given a green flag, you would show that on your car, and that would give you the right of way. So citizens start reacting. They start setting up food kitchens in neighborhoods where there's no access to food, particularly if you're sick and you can't get out. And you see the closure sign. These are omnipresent signs in Philadelphia. People's behavior begins to change. People are avoiding their neighbors. They're talking at a great distance. We've seen news clips of what's going on in China with the coronavirus, how businesses transacted with everybody wearing masks and trying to keep a distance. Imagine that sort of improvisation going on in social relationships and business relationship in Philadelphia. You would have a good picture. But Cruzen finally steps to the fore. Cruzen was completely overwhelmed by this, and again, had no resources to devote to this. He even approached the U.S. Navy and said, well, you have a big presence in Philadelphia, you run the shipyards, would you be willing to take over the management of the disease in the city? The Navy said, no, that's your job. But when the volunteer committee decides to do what I just described, Cruzen decides that's the best game in town. I'm going to put resources at their disposal. And to his credit, he finds money in the city budget and puts it at the disposal of the committee to use for their house calls. This is a family photograph taken in the early 1920s from a family, twin boys, these younger children. It's the Conway family. The parents had just immigrated from Ireland a few years ago. The father, Patrick Conway, was working, continued to work while the pandemic was going on. But they had a young daughter named Elizabeth, who was 3 years old, 1918. And not a lot of time on this planet to establish a record of your personality, but she was lively and loved to simulate tea parties with dolls and get everybody involved with this. She got the flu, and she died of the flu. The father had to take her out and bury her himself. This photograph for the family today, which is still in the Philadelphia area, is not only a marker of family history representing the people who were there, but it shouts out the person who is not there. And the family recalls that for years afterwards, the father, Patrick, would absent himself from family affairs, he would go down in the basement and pull out Elizabeth's dolls and just sit with them for a while. Come November, an armistice takes place. Coincidentally, the flu starts to diminish. Now, I mentioned one person dying of the flu every 5 minutes over a 6-week period in Philadelphia, but the deaths continued for months with a gradual tapering off to what were quote-unquote normal or average mortality rates for Philadelphia, absent the flu. Things had reached the point of terror and fear for people that some of these instances of odd reactions to what was happening were starting to show up in the newspaper, despite not reporting grim news. The Philadelphia Inquirer reports, for example, that one woman who caught the flu was worried that she was going to die of it. And she had in her care her 9-year-old niece. And this woman decided she's going to commit suicide and take the niece with her. She finds some poison tablets. She takes 2. She gives the niece 2. And the aunt then slashes her wrists, hurls her niece down a well, and then jumps in after her. Oddly enough, both of them survived. Neighbors called. But that was in the newspaper. Also in the newspaper was a doctor who made a house call in his own car. Nothing remarkable about that, except when he came out after administering to that patient in a private home, there were 57 mothers, reported in the newspaper, 57, around his car, simultaneously yelling at him to come to their house. They had patients. They're not going to let him go until he sees them. So that doctor made 57 more house calls before he left the neighborhood. Nurses going to houses ran into the same thing. Of course, the nurses are in those uniforms. They're quite visible at a distance. People would come to them and offer them $100 bribes. Don't go there. Come to my house. I have a sick child. I have a sick husband. Whatever the family member might be. This was the state of things. So people were really reluctant to go out and do anything. But the mortality starts to decline. Here you have some soldier graves. This particular in remembrance stone is not in Philadelphia. It's worth noting that we've got monuments to generals and statesmen. We have battlefields you can visit. But diseases don't leave that kind of material trail. There's no monument anywhere in Philadelphia to call attention to the flu. Before our exhibit run ends in 5 years, I hope to change that. Another Philadelphia family, Jean Shinnick was remembered by her family as a worrywart. She worried about everything. They lived in a house that had a little pond behind it. And every time the pond level dropped, Jean Shinnick would get hysterical and complain to the family that it's the environmental crisis, we're all going to die. And people in the family started making a joke about this. But then again, she had some reason, and they gave her some slack because her father committed suicide when she was 14. She lived through the flu. She lived through the Depression. She lived through World War II. But only one time did she tell her family this one story. When she was a child, about 8 years old, she got the flu, and she was bedridden. And as she started to recover, she got up one day and walked out onto the porch of their suburban home and wondered why it was that the neighbors across the street were all sleeping in their front yard. And she looked up the street, and she looked down the street, and she saw people apparently sleeping in their yards. And then she realized they were all dead, perhaps waiting for Frank Bieberstein and his fellow seminarian with their cart to come take them away. So what had just happened? 1 in 4 Americans get sick. And that average pretty much plays for Philadelphia as well. I mentioned the statistic about the 6 weeks, and I mentioned the young adults. But also, during the American Civil War of the 1860s, 1 soldier died in combat for every 2 soldiers who died of disease in the military environment. And ever since that war, that has been reversed. more soldiers in combat than those dying of disease, except for World War I. We had approximately 116,000 soldiers die in World War I. 55% of those died of disease, mostly the flu. So the flu was doing its work on the battlefield, and it was hitting both sides of the war. Back to President Wilson. Now, I mentioned the heavy censorship of this era. President Wilson never once during the pandemic made any public comment acknowledging its existence. None, nothing. No federal agency delivered any services to localities, to the states. There was no FEMA then. There was some, certainly publicity. The Surgeon General put out posters, pamphlets, giving people some practical health advice, like take the laxative and all that stuff. And I remember also these lists include, don't worry. That's one of the things they recommend you not do. Don't worry. One of the problems, and Philadelphia was a good example of this, is how do we know the extent, the magnitude of what happened here? When we are in the grip of something significant, coronavirus is a good example, we have surveillance systems now in place that require reporting of diseases. If physicians are writing death certificates, if they're in hospitals and see patients, they have to report data. Data has to be collected quickly. This determines, of course, how we respond, where we provide aid. We still do not have an accurate picture of how many people died during the pandemic throughout the world, and almost every part of this planet was hit by the flu. So the death count could be 50 million. It could be 100 million. It's certainly the biggest killer disease of all time in the history of this planet. So Wilson just set it aside. The war was paramount. But think of also the other consequences. If people are disabled, their families, they're losing family members, we now have children walking around whose parents are either disabled or dead. One child was found wandering the street and followed to this child's house, and in one room was the father, the mother, and the mother had just given birth 24 hours before. The father was dead in his chair. The mother was so ill with the flu that she could not reach the apple on the table next to her, and she was holding and trying to nurse a baby. Now, the debilitation is so severe here that there was another Philadelphia man who became flu ill in his house, and as one soldier described the symptoms, it was like being repeatedly beaten with a baseball bat. And this man in his house realized that he might die in that house. He had no strength. He was feeling quite ill. And his only way to save himself was probably to get out in the yard and attract a passerby. It took him a couple days to crawl out along the floor into his garden. And he survived this. He managed to reach a point under an apple tree in his yard. And his salient memory years later were the apples sporadically dropping on him as he was there for 3 days before a passerby found him and got him assistance. So Philadelphia is full of stories like this. Orphans. That one girl who took some nurses to that room and found the dead father and the mother. Sometimes the parents were dead and the children were simply wandering about. City infrastructure was so disabled here that the advice went out, if you see a child wandering your neighborhood, just take him in. Find a child, take care of him. You're not reporting this to anybody. There's nobody to report it to. Just take care of them. The above is a statement by an historian, which I think adequately sums up the picture worldwide. This is a disease that resculpted populations. Now, I have a picture of a floating mine from World War II here for a reason. It looks like the flu virus. Now, for those of you that pay attention to these things, when you get a flu shot, the flu shot you had administered this season, and I'm assuming everybody in here got one, was aimed at H1N1. Now, that's a flu variant. I think there are somewhere around 18 possible H's and 9 or 10 or 11 N's, so there's a lot of combinations here. But H1N1, we now know, was the killer virus of 1918. Why it was so lethal then, nobody knows. There's some good reasons or some good speculation about it, but nobody knows for certain. And it's worth remembering that we have not left the 1918 flu strain. You got a shot this season against that very strain. The 1957 world pandemic of flu, the 1968 one, and the 2009 swine flu, all of those flus are genetically linked to the 1918 flu. So this has never really gone away. And if you're up for fancy words, that's what the H means, and that's what the N means. And remember that cyanotic man. The genius of the flu virus, why it works so well and why I'm representing it by a mine, is imagine the spikes having tips that are the H's, and then the stems themselves are the N's. It's the H's that tear open those cells that exchange oxygen in your lungs. And it's the N, once the H is in there, that burrows through into other cells and implants the virus and gets it going. So your body marshals antibodies against the H, and then the N comes in behind and swoops in for the kill. But I said that the scientific work to identify the virus and find a reliable virus began in earnest in 1918, and it continued, and it wasn't until the 1930s that the virus is finally identified, in the end of World War II, when we had the first effective vaccine. Now we see this. We see occasional front page articles like this. This is pre-coronavirus. This is 3 years ago. And we were being warned. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. In 2016, there was a World Congress of experts who made the prognostication that over the next century, we are likely to experience 4 pandemics, one of which is going to be the flu. We might be seeing the other one right now. Now, the death count on the flu virus could be between 12 and 50,000 people a year in this country. So before getting too scared about deaths due to coronavirus, the flu keeps doing it. And during the 2017-2018 flu season, 79,000 Americans died of the flu. That's the largest number since the swine flu pandemic of 2009. So these things are still happening around us while we're worrying about coronavirus. And it's not for nothing that the CDC and some of the other authoritative organizations are blending coronavirus and flu information. Just this morning, I got this. Buy this mask. It's here. It's happening. Save yourself. And in 1918, the hated immigrant group was the German. Remember those posters? German music is no longer being performed. The Bayer company that makes aspirin, German-owned firm. The United States Department of Health had to conduct a very public investigation to make sure there was no German flu secreted in them, their tablets, being unleashed upon Americans. People were worried that German submarines were delivering the flu. In Philadelphia, a traveling salesman named Thomas booked into a hotel, and some people thought he was suspiciously German. So they called the police, who detained him briefly, interviewed him, decided he was nothing, a traveling salesman. He was found in his hotel room the next morning with his throat cut. The police said it was suicide. Dachshunds are being killed. But for some parts of the German culture, we can't give up like sauerkraut. We have to rename it, so it becomes Liberty Cabbage. So, President Wilson didn't say anything. We have a president now who's saying something. And I guess this is the new bigotry with a happy face. No Asians here. Thank you for your understanding. And reports are already surfacing of discriminatory activities towards anybody who looks Asian. Doesn't have to be Chinese. Anybody is suspect. So it's deja vu all over again in some respects. Now, this is a word I do not know how to pronounce, but I'll bet there's somebody on the faculty in this institution who does. This is a word coined by the Yupik people in Alaska. Now, Alaska experienced, in the eastern half of Alaska, the highest mortality of any part of the United States. 40% of infected native Alaskans died of the flu. Nobody knows precisely why. Entire villages were wiped out. A few villages that might have been affected took early measures to simply quarantine themselves, not allow anybody in or out, and managed to survive. But this word is a word that those who survived the flu in this culture agreed. They made a pact. This refers to the forgetting. They are not going to talk about it. They're not going to acknowledge it. They're not going to teach their young about it. It's simply something out of space, out of time. It happened. We can't go there. So that is one way that some people have coped with this in the aftermath. But how do we remember this flu? Sometimes it's portrayed as the forgotten epidemic. Well, it was, of course, subordinate to the war effort. And remember the censorship. The idea was to keep this out of the public view while we managed the war effort. But even so, a lot of books and articles were being written about the flu, and the scientific language to understand the flu, to describe, identify symptoms, all of that continues to evolve into the kind of clinical language that we're used to today. But as I mentioned with battlefields and generals and statues, there's no material evidence of this. And it's a strange pandemic that effectively leaves very few traces except the virus, which continues to circulate. It made no impact on the institutions. When hospitals picked up the pieces, they went on as before. No changes were made. What we do have, however, are personal narratives versus collective ones. There was never any public, collective memorialization of what had happened. There was no mass prayer meeting, for example, for Philadelphians to commemorate their families. They were simply expected to pick up the pieces and move on. And of course, we're into the 1920s very shortly, and we got other issues. The rise of fascism in Europe, the Great Depression comes, you just pick up the pieces. And think of Patrick Conway and his silent grief. If you would like to get into the head of somebody who was there and who can place you within her own experience, Catherine Ann Porter. Now this painting commemorates her and her Ship of Fools book, which became a bestseller. But she was a young journalist in her early 20s when the flu happened. She was in Denver working for a paper. She had a lover who was an American Army lieutenant. Both of them came down with the flu. But she went down into the depths of this with the distortion of senses of the sight, the smell, hallucinations. All of this is articulated in her novella, Pale Horse, Pale Rider, which is still in print. You also get a big picture of the larger cultural currents of the day with the war happening over there. The 4 Minutemen, for example, make their appearance, not very favorably in this book. There are also other cultural arguments of the moment, such as this newfangled wearing of wristwatches by men. Is it effeminate or not? That's also in the novel. But she was in her 20s and she came out of this. She survived it. And when she came out of it, her hair went white at age 23 or 24. She also discovered that her American lieutenant didn't make it. He died of the flu. So how we commemorated this at the Mütter Museum? Well, we opened up an exhibition in October, and I'd like to remind you that my colleague Michael Keyes is out in the lobby with some show-tell items, nothing contaminated by the flu. Plus, there is a handout, if you're interested, of suggested readings and some web links, including the Centers for Disease Control, which is the authoritative site to consult these days. But in preparing this, we had to do some original research because the public health records for Philadelphia just don't say a lot. And we found, even in our own research for this exhibit, that the official reported death count for Philadelphia is probably an undercount. We found evidence that the counts were higher in other domains and simply not maybe reported or acknowledged by authorities. So we have opened this exhibit. Some of what I have said to you today is incorporated in the exhibit. We've been able to get very generous funding for this. And when we embarked on this project 6 years ago to conceptualize this, we figured, and this wasn't necessarily a pessimistic view, that this exhibit would run for about 5 years. And at any given moment during its run, people would come to it with something in their head from the news. Ebola, some other disease outbreak, who knew? But in looking for artifacts of the disease that leaves no traces, we found some interesting things. Now, the typewritten correspondence up there, we took a look at the archive at Bryn Mawr College. Turns out they quarantined the whole campus during the pandemic. And there's an amazing set of correspondence between a student and her family on the outside about what's going on the outside, what's going on the inside. So we've incorporated some of that. None of this has ever been exhibited anywhere before, as far as we know. The Catholic Archdiocese, I mentioned, with their very disturbing photo archive of collecting coffins and digging graves. Some of these items that you see up here could have been from any other era, standard nursing bedside treatments. But the purse is an interesting story. It turns out Drexel University has a costume collection. We were making inquiries, do they have anything related to the flu? Well, it turns out a young woman, pregnant white woman, married, named Naomi Ford, before the flu happened, decided to get a jump on Christmas buying for her women relatives. And she went out and bought some high fashion items for her women friends. Wrote out the labels, sometimes wrote little poems, got gift boxes for these items, and then she died of the flu. The family took the presents and put them in the attic where they remained for decades. These are undelivered Christmas presents. So we have this handbag on display, high fashion item for 1918, handwritten by Naomi Ford on the label and never delivered to its recipient. This is how you take large numbers and convey the tragedy by individual stories. We also did something we don't often do. We created interactives that allow you to access death certificates. We have some death certificates out there you can take home. They are capsule biographies. And the city put about 20,000 death certificates online. We went through them all and created a database. So if you come through our exhibit and you happen to be a university student and want to find out, did university students die? You can find out who they are, where they lived. If you're a doctor, find doctors. If you work in a factory, maybe a factory worker. So we have interactives that will allow you to even look at what happened in your own house in 1918 or on your street. You can look at how the flu progressed through your neighborhood over the course of weeks. If you are of Italian descent and want to see what Italians did, what happened to them, you can do it. This is just a screenshot of one of the interactives to give you an idea of what you can do. Probably the most poignant thing we did, activity, is a parade. And there's at least one person in here, too, that I recall, who were in this parade. Remember the Liberty Loan Parade of 1918? We engaged some artists, a collective from the UK known as Blast Theory, who are accustomed to doing very large-scale projects. And we said, we want you to come in and take inspiration from some aspect of this pandemic and create a work of art in any medium that speaks to it. We didn't want a painting of a flu victim to hang on the wall. We wanted something in its own right. And they said, we got it. They looked at the photograph of the Spit Spreads death sign on the lamppost and said, let's recreate the Liberty Loan Parade. I thought, 200,000 people? They said, no, we'll do it smaller. So we followed the original route. We did it on the 101st anniversary of the parade. Hundreds of people signed up, many people wanting to represent their own relatives. So you see people in the parade. It happened at dusk. And it was also a light show parade, but they're holding up their mobile phones for a reason. We had a composer compose music for this event, and it was performed by a choral group, The Crossing, if you're familiar with them, award-winning. And they created a kind of Gregorian chant that chanted the names of the dead and also the instructions given by public health officials. And so we were surrounded by ambient music as we marched up to terminate in City Hall, where, by the way, we had a flu shot booth set up and we got a lot of takers. Free flu shots. This was a really powerful experience, and the woman in the upper right was representing her own ancestor who died of the flu. Now, we've had an unexpected outcome to this. People have been approaching us, and it happened to me here tonight with a woman in the audience tonight, to say, I have a family flu story to tell. And some people are coming to us directly at the museum, telling us these stories, and saying, you know, these stories are still a matter of great traumatic moment in our family histories, even though none of us were alive at the time. But they're horrific tales, and we are collecting those. And if any of you want to contribute such a story, we are open to this. And in 2020, we're going to create an online scrapbook so people can read those stories and see what their fellow Philadelphians endured. And these stories truly range from comic to ultra tragic, as you might expect. So we created this, and a film of this is shown in our gallery on a loop. It's about a 13-minute film, and I think it's a quite powerful piece of our exhibit. Published in 1918. Our exhibit is, and we had other activities, some of them are still ongoing, are meant to be a commemorative event. The commemorative event that Philadelphia never had, and the parade ditto. So we hope that people come to the exhibit, meditate on the experience, and also think about what you would do. What should we do if coronavirus gets worse? Or some other disease comes into view where we have to do drastic things. The government is very reluctant to pass laws restricting behavior during disease outbreak, and the CDC used to have a rule that once about 1% of the population dies of the thing, that's when we move in and create restrictive laws. Well, that's 3 million plus people that have to die before that happens. And I don't know if that rule's been revised, but it just shows you the reluctance to interfere with people's liberty. So we are expected to look to ourselves, make plans. Do you have a pandemic plan? We encourage you to talk about it. So, I thank you very much, and I like to come back to that nurse image and the button. The button she has in the picture, which I am highlighting here, is that 4th Liberty Loan button. This nurse ain't no slacker. Thank you very much. I think we have time for questions.